Hey, I think we've got a couple of people joined already. So welcome to today's session of the Trans-Sahara Expert Talks Series. We're delighted to introduce Professor Dan Biller from the Crummer Graduate School of Business in Florida. And delighted to have back again Dr. Daphne Gondolacker and Professor Demel Tekete-Fanta, who have agreed to moderate today. So very lucky to have two moderators today. So we're just going to have about a 40-minute presentation, as I'm sure most of you know, and then we'll have 20 minutes for Q&A after. So just as always, feel free to drop any questions in the chat or the Q&A section, and I'll keep an eye on them for you. So just to quickly introduce our two moderators first. So Daphne Gondolacker is a professor at the Chair of Urban Water Systems Engineering in the School of Engineering and Design at the Technical University of Munich in Germany. Her research focus is integrated in urban planning, the water, energy, food ecosystems nexus, and the multi-stakeholder participatory co-creation process in Africa and Asia. She holds a PhD in ecosystem studies from the University of Tokyo and a master's and bachelor's in architecture and urban planning. Prior to joining TUM, she worked as a postdoctoral associate at the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the US and the Center for Development Research at the University of Bonn in Germany. So all very impressive accolades from Daphne. And Professor Demel Tekete-Fanta has worked as Professor of Forest Scientists and the founding dean of the Faculty of Natural Resources at the Botswana University of Agriculture and Natural Resources, where he has also served within the Department of Range and Forest Resources between 2014 and 2025, where he completed his contract with the university. And currently he's an independent professional based in Addis Ababa and Ethiopia. He has held senior academic research and leadership positions across Africa and Europe, including professional, managerial, and research fellow roles in Botswana, Kenya, Ghana, Sweden, the Netherlands, and Ethiopia. So all over the place, really. And Professor Fanta has published more than 300 scientific articles and technical reports, mostly in high-impact scientific journals published by reputable publishers. So that's our two moderators for today. And then Professor Biller, who is giving his presentation, is a professor of practice in economics who joined Rollins College at the Crummer School of Business in 2019 from the World Bank Group. At the World Bank, he held several managerial and technical positions. In his last position, he was the manager of the economics unit in the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, which is known as MIGA, the political risk insurance arm of the World Bank Group, overseeing their country and project risk assessment, as well as the analysis of development impacts. And prior to joining MIGA in 2013, Dr. Biller was the Sustainable Development Lead Economist for the World Bank South Asia region, lead economist for the East Asia and Pacific region, and the Environment and Natural Resources Program leader at the World Bank Institute. He was also a senior economist at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development and has taught at universities and worked with private sector and governments on infrastructure and mining hydrocarbon regulatory issues while he was on the staff at the Getulio Vargas Foundation in Brazil. And finally, Dr. Biller has published extensively on topics such as economic development, natural resources and environment economics, sustainable consumption, urban-rural linkages, infrastructure, climate change, and social development issues. He has received his PhD and master's degree in economics from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and has a bachelor's degree in economics with a minor in geophysics from the University of Kansas. So welcome to him. I think that's the longest introduction I've had to do so far. Can't get through it without tripping up. But yeah, without further ado, I'll pass the floor to him unless we've got any words from anyone else before we start.
I just also, in the name of the Trans-Sahara Project, would like to welcome Professor Biller to give this talk. We're really delighted to have you. I think the length of the bio explains the excellence of your work background. So we're delighted to have you as an advisory board member, and we look forward to your talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the length, and I apologize for the lengthy introduction, but thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you for the invitation to talk about sort of a pet topic, which is green bonds. So from my discussion with Professor Gonhalager, we thought that could be an idea to explore possibilities of using green bonds in the Trans-Sahara project. And I will try to, if I am too basic in certain things, please expedite my explanations, and I'll try to leave as much as possible for discussion, because I think that this is really an initial discussion. So thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the introduction. So to explain my present.
Sorry, can I suggest that you put the slides in slide mode? Slide mode.
They are in presentation mode.
All right.
Can you see them?
Yes.
Okay. So as outlined, basically, I'll give you the context of a very quick context on environmental policy making and where green bonds may fit, the motivation for doing research and studying this activity, this type of instrument. We'll need to discuss the definitions of green bonds, market players, also an alternative idea for green bonds, and I'll explain this later. I think it's very interesting to discuss a little bit of political risk insurance, and conclude. So if we need to put this into context, and we think about environmental policy making pretty much all over the world, what you have is an intersection of environmental policies and legal frameworks producing instruments like command and control, economic instruments. Green bonds will be in part following in this area on the lower left bubble of the diagram. Basically, you can also use evaluation, and I mentioned valuation because essentially environmental issues are generally considered market failures in economics. So you don't have really markets to evaluate easily the value, say, of biodiversity, for example. So valuation can help you out on instrument design and priority setting, and basically all falls into the information story, which is probably the biggest challenge on this environmental policy making. Now, in terms of motivation, basically, my motivation here is the comparison between process versus performance and output versus outcome. So essentially, when we think about environmental issues, we are basically heavily dependent on regulations and the output oriented. What do I mean by that? Well, basically what you regulate are processes and end-of-pipe type of situations. But what we really interested on as individuals and societies is ambient quality. So the relationship between, say, a process and an end-of-pipe pollution versus ambient quality is not so simple, right? And when we regulate processes and end of pipe of output, we end up not getting what we're trying to get, which is better ambient quality. Now, with those regulations, you also have incentives, and people act accordingly. So to give you an example, and we'll talk about this, how we would work, for example, with green bonds, is the context of climate change. You have then the NDCs, and essentially you have commitments for countries. In the case of Brazil, they have a commitment for zero illegal deforestation in Brazil, Amazon, by 2030, if I'm not mistaken. I want to keep this in the parking lot because I'll come back to this. Now, environmental improvement usually comes via public and civil society or NGO investments. There is some level of private sector changes, and private sector is generally focused on either improving efficiencies and or using this for marketing purposes, but this remains outside of the core business, let's say. And it makes sense because as an externality, environmental issues are are basically non-intended consequences to third parties. Now, the other context that we have to think about is that most countries and nowadays, in particular after COVID and so on, are facing very high debt and a lack of fiscal space to make things like environmental investments. That's true both in developed and developing countries. So having said that, there is an overall, and I call it perceived, demand for more and better environmental assets. So the question becomes, how can we capture this demand? That has been always a challenge, I would say, on the environmental policy agenda. And my point is, environmental investments are somewhat similar to infrastructure investments. So my question is, why not design an instrument that premiate performance and outcomes, meaning focus on ambient quality rather than emissions, effluents, and the pipe focus. So this is where green bonds comes. Now, just to give you a little bit of a flavor, why green bonds or why bonds are important, in a very nutshell, bonds are the global bond market is by far the largest market financial instrument market in the world. We're talking about $145 trillion in 2024. US probably holds about 40% of this market. You have sovereigns, meaning governments, sub-sovereigns, corporates, all involved in this market, IFI, international financial institutions as well. Now, in what we're going to call green bonds, it's a small part of this market. So just to give you a point of comparison, the global bond market, as I mentioned, is $145 trillion in 2024. Just to give an idea, the US GDP, gross domestic product, is about $25 trillion. The equity market, meaning stocks that we talk a lot about in the news and so on, it's about $126 trillion. And by far, the largest market is the New York Stock Exchange. Now, of course, as you can see, the bond market is a much larger market. Wouldn't it be nice if we can basically get some of this money invested in environmental issues? And the question here is, how can we do that? Well, one way, it's what's called green bonds. Basically, green bonds, as any bond, is a debt, but essentially it earmarks use of proceeds for environmental purposes. So essentially, the first green bond was rumored to be issued by World Bank and European Investment Bank back in the middle of the first decade of the millennium. Now, let me say it with a grain of salt here, because we don't really have a widely accepted definition of a green bond. So since we don't have a widely accepted definition of green bond, I've been breaking my head trying to put together a database that tells me the size of this market. But there are estimates, and the estimates vary greatly. So right now, one reasonable estimate is that a green bond corresponds to about 3 trillion US dollars. And if you include social sustainability linked bonds and so on, maybe it goes up to 6 trillion US dollars. So as you can see, it's a niche market within a very large market. Now, being a niche market, it's also a very rapidly growing market. So that makes it a very interesting opportunity. Now, how does this work? Basically, in the normal, let's say, green bond, a company, a sovereign, a IFI issues a bond, a debt in the market, saying we're going to use the proceeds that we gathered from the market in this debt and put it in specific investments that mitigate some sort of environmental issue. So by and large, you're earmarking your proceeds from this bond into specific investment. Now notice that the government, for example, could issue a bond and basically use the money for general expenditures. In this case, they are specifically targeting particular expenditures. Now, where do then they often go? They often go to certified climate-related investments like renewables, energy efficiency, carbon mitigation measures, and so on. Notice that this is important because this needs to be certified, and you have to have very clear indicators of how you're achieving the goals that you said that you're going to achieve. Now, again, bearing in mind that this numbers varies a lot, it has been experiencing rapid growth. And cumulatively, about 80 years ago, we went from zero to about $250 billion. Now, this also prompted a different types of instruments related to green bonds. So you could have specific blue bonds, humanitarian, social, ESG related bonds. So in front of you, what you see is a brief description of this market. I have tried to get this information. I'll be honest, I even contacted the guy through my RA in the IFC. I never was able to get this data because I was looking for definitions and so on and so forth. But there is some sense into this graph that I would like to call your attention to. A large portion of it is in OECD countries. I would say probably that Europe, it's one of the largest issuer of green bonds. There's a fairly large portion of supranational, meaning IFIs. There is also non-OECD countries issuing green bonds, primarily large emerging economies like China, India, and Brazil. The other point that I'd like to raise with you on your right graph is that you have different types, let's say, of issuers, right? So you have corporates, which are the majority. You also have sovereign supranational agencies and municipal, which are the seconds. And lastly, asset-based securities and mortgage-based securities. Now, the potential for this growth, as far as I could see, it's quite interesting. And basically, it's probably, or maybe it's one of the largest issuings that you get in terms of growth in the market. So who issues green bonds? Well, as I mentioned, geographically, mostly OECD, but large economies, large emerging economies, and IFIs, international financial corporations, almost half corporates, but also sovereign, such sovereign FI, to less extent, as I mentioned, asset-based and mortgage-based securities. Proceeds, remember, are ring fence. Who buys those bonds? Well, the same buyers of bonds. So pension funds are probably the largest buyers of bonds in the world, together with governments, but also insurance companies and sovereign wealth funds. Now, why do they buy these bonds? Well, again, as I mentioned, perceived stakeholder demand, some regulatory advantage to finance environmental objectives, and signaling the importance of environmental objectives, which essentially it's a way of marketing. Now, an important aspect here is that there's no real difference between, let's say, green bonds and usual bonds. They are subject for being risk-weighted and credit worthiness of the issuer. They are possibly traded in secondary markets, and the issuers are varied. So why do I say that? Because essentially what you got in a green bond, you're adding a risk, but you're not necessarily getting an advantage or disadvantage on your price or your yield of the bond. What do I mean by that? Well, any bond has the risk of default. So you have the risk of default, say Brazil risk, but on top of that, you have the risk of not having the environmental goals achieved by the time that the bond matures. So, and again, as I mentioned, this is pretty much based on processes and ring fencing of the proceeds. Now, this is not necessarily the interest on if you're looking from environmental lens. If you're looking from environmental lens, you're really interested on the outcome, on the performance, on the ambient quality, rather than the output and the process. So rather than earmarking investments being financed, an outcome-based green bond would focus on the environmental quality that the issuer of the bond can deliver. So this will be somewhat similar to indexing a bond, like indexing a bond to inflation. I know if you are familiar with this type of instruments, that's a huge market. Essentially, what you're paid a yield, a percentage, an interest rate, plus an inflation rate of the future. Now, to do that, you need the quality improvement to be well-defined and measurable. And this is one of the reasons why I insisted in seeing key performance indicators on the Trans-Sahara project. And you may need some benchmarking to compare. Markets would then value environmental performance of the issuer, penalizing it via increased coupon payments if environmental degradation increases, or compensating it by discounts if environmental degradation decreases. So if I look at this simple bond formula describing price, as you can see, bond price is inversely related with the interest rate or the yield. I simply am adding something to this I. Okay. Now, why would political risk could be helpful on this? Well, generally, outcome-based green bond issuers are likely to be the same as a green bonds issuer. So you are actually adding an extra risk, which is the environmental risk, as we described. Now, part of this environmental risk is subject to regulatory policy change and thus political risk. And this is something that could then, a political risk insurance could help in, let's say, stimulating a market like this. So if you think about it, Emerging economies are likely to be attractive to this type of instrument because you have this need for additional capital. In other words, you have capital constraints, but you also at the same time have natural resource abundance. Usually, just a brief mention of what does PRI, political risk insurance, covers. It covers transfer and convertibility of currency, expropriation and breach of contract, non-honoring of financial obligations of sovereign, sub-sovereign, and state-owned enterprises, war and civil disturbance. So in our case here, what we're discussing is pretty much related to three initial described products, A, B, and C, particularly C, of course. Now, you could have something like a non-honoring of environmental obligations contemplated, and therefore an insurance issued, a guaranteed issued against this, this lack of compliance, let's say. Now, I mentioned Basel compliance. I'm not going to go into details on this, but basically you're trying to diminish or mitigate this regulatory uncertainty. Now, let me conclude before we start the discussion. Basically, the idea of a green bond is to capture that market demand for this environmental assets, whatever assets we're talking about here. They are not substitute for policies or regulations, right? If you look at the monetary estimates to achieve the SDGs and climate goals, are generally way above the current global expenditures, would make me think that those achievements will not be done by the time that we're trying to achieve them. Now, current green bonds is growing, but this is mainly focused on process and outputs. And really, what I'm looking for is something that that is more focused on ambient quality, as I mentioned. So to give you a very clear example using this Brazilian example, by 2030, I believe, Brazil is trying to eliminate illegal deforestation, or by 2028, I think it's illegal deforestation, and by 2030, no net loss of Amazon forestry. Now, this is measurable via satellite pictures, right? Via GIS. So this is something that I can transform into let's say, a measurable target that I can therefore put in a outcome-based green bonds. And if this is achieved, Brazil could experience lower coupon payments and even decrease in the principal. If this is not achieved, well, Brazil would then be penalized for not delivering this outcome, right? So it's clear also that you're adding this environmental risk to things like default risk, but there is a compensation mechanism to this. Now, the other advantage is that you can either, because bonds, you can have like what's called a zero coupon bond, which is you get back payment of interest and principal at the end of a period, at maturity. But you could also have bonds, and this is more common, bonds that pay coupons periodically. So this can also be done assessing periodically whether your environmental target is getting closer or not. This is somewhat similar to environmental impact bonds. Environmental impact bonds have not taken off that much, but there are a few that are in the market. And essentially what they are basically related to infrastructures of environmental nature. So water and sanitation, recuperation of wetlands, and things like this. You have the examples of Atlanta on water, and I think DC also, Washington DC has them, and Durham in North Carolina has them as well. Now, is this, for example, very, very new? Well, it is new, but things, let's say, there were other financial instruments in the past that have been used. The example is when you have an increase in indebtedness in countries back in the late 80s, early 90s, you got debt for nature swaps. The point here is that you are basically relying more and more on the market to deliver or to help you deliver the environmental quality that you're trying to achieve. Mostly today, if you as an individual want to make a difference in improving environment, you usually have to be part of an NGO, or you go try political pressures and so on. Now, if you have instruments in the financial markets that can help you, you can put your money, let's say, directly where your mouth is. Now, additional work for this, well, you have several, let's say, gaps that would need to be filled. You have to have the financial engineering well worked, detailing the role of political risk insurance, understanding firm and government level decision making, development of derivatives, among others. Now, what I did was I checked the labs, the countries where they are, and so on. And because one important thing is that those, let's say, if you're planning to issue a bond in a country, it would be good if the country has a bond market. So essentially, and if the country is rated, right, by international credit agencies, and all of them, with the exception of Chad and Djibouti, are internationally rated by credit agencies. I think that the best rated ones are maybe Tunisia and Ghana. And what this could do also is to help these countries lift their credit agency, their credit ratings, in case they're able to deliver what they're promising. Thank you very much, and I'm more than happy to discuss these ideas.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Professor Biller, for this insightful talk. And it's really, as I said, the perfect point in time in Trans-Sahara to have your input. And now I will directly want to use the time as best as possible by opening the floor to all the questions that I'm sure that we all have. I have a whole bunch, but I would like to invite Professor Fanta to go first.
Okay, thank you very much, Daphne. And thank you very much, Prof. Pillars, for your excellent educational and insightful presentation. I have enjoyed the presentation very much. I had also the privilege of getting the presentations earlier, so I've gone through it, and then I have also tried to Google some of the terms that I have never been aware of. I have a couple of questions, and the first one, I think you have touched upon the outcome green bond as being, related to ambient quality focused rather than output or process. And what does that mean? Second one is, what are coupon prepayments and who issues coupon payments? The third one, can you please elaborate on credit rating? And why is it likely a requirement to countries like Ethiopia, Ghana, Senegal, Tunisia, and you also said Djibouti? And one of the most practical question I would like to ask is also something that maybe you have overlooked in your presentation, but initially it was in the content of the presentation. What are the potential use of green bonds in the Trans-Sahara project? And the other one, I have a background of forest certification, and I would like to know how green bonds are assessed and certified or credited. What are the actual procedures and steps involved? Maybe this might be out of your scope of presentation, but I would be very happy to hear about the process involved in assessing and certifying green bonds, if possible. Thank you so much, Daphne and Prof. Billers.
Okay, Daphne, may I try to respond? And please remind me if I miss some of the questions. Starting with the simplest one, coupon. So bonds generally are issued, they have a maturity. So let's say 10 years, it's a common maturity, it could be 3 years, whatever. They have a maturity, and this maturity, they pay you a less coupon, which is an interest, plus the principal. So let's say you want to build a bridge in a country, you issue a bond for $300 million, paying back investors in 10 years. So on the 10th year, you pay, let's say, the principal, which is $300 million. Everybody will get the amount that they bought, that they lend the issuer, and they also pay an interest because it's the issue of the time value of money, right? If I have $100,000, why will I lend Daphne the money if I don't get an interest in X amount of time? Maybe 2 days I'll lend it to her, but if she wants it for 10 years, I may want to be compensated, even though we're good friends, I would say. So that's the same story here. Now, those coupons are generally paid either biannually or once a year. Okay, so at a certain date, you're paid a coupon all the way to the 10th year in my example. Yeah, so that's how these things work. So I gave the formula of how to incorporate this in the price of a bond. So meaning if quality issuer issues a bond paying, giving higher interest, people will basically buy the other bond and price in the market will equate. So that's why price and yield are inversely related. So this is one answer to your question. I hope it's clear. Now the other answer to your question is, well, why do they need to be rated? So usually what international credit agencies like Moody's or S&P try to do is rate issuers according to the risk of default or the loss given default. So Moody's basically is loss given default, and S&P is the risk of default. So what does it mean? Well, it means that whoever is issuing debt may default on the debt. So you want to know what's the likelihood of this default, and this is what these international agencies do, right? Credit agencies. This would, in principle, let's say, translate into the price of a bond and therefore into the yield of a bond. So, for example, I checked Senegal is rated by S&P, what's called CCC plus, which is basically very close to default. So Senegal has not defaulted, but it's close to default, right? In the sovereign. So I would expect that the given risk reward, Senegal has to pay a much higher interest to borrow from the market than, say, Switzerland, which is rated AAA, the lowest possible default in the market. So I think that that's more or less answers the question. Tunisia, for example, it's double B minus, which is better than Senegal. So I would expect that Tunisia, for the same length of time in the debt, will be able to capture money in the market for lower interest. Now, the difference between ambient and process, I think that there was a question on this. Well, as societies, I would say that we're probably more interested in having a clean environment, less deforestation, and this is your ambient quality. Nowadays, we have a lot of technology that allows us to try to measure ambient quality. But that relationship between end of pipe, let's say, regulations that try to curtail pollution at the end of a polluter, of an emitter, let's say, and ambient quality, it's not one-to-one. So if we are interested basically in better ambient quality, can we have incentives and instruments that address this particular issue? And that's where the outcome based green bonds idea comes from. I think that there was another question. I'm missing one. The certification. So the issue is, so if I think about deforestation as one outcome that I could think, for example, I'm not saying that this is the right certifier. I'm no specialist in certification, but I need somebody that tells me that indeed the country has achieved its target of deforestation, right? In the case of Brazil, by 2030, the commitment is no net deforestation, I think, in the Amazon forest. So if the country issues a bond saying, look, lend me this money so I can invest in whatever I want, and I'll promise you a rate of interest as return, plus no net forest loss in the Amazon, I need somebody to certify that. Now, how is it going to be certified? Well, most likely it's going to be through satellite pictures or GIS of deforestation. These are pretty transparent and accessible. Now, who's going to certify this? I would prefer that the certification would come from, well, good reputation certifiers. Maybe FSC is one of them that could do that. There could be others. So that's the idea.
Thank you very much indeed for the questions and the insightful answers. Professor Fanta, did that cover everything that you wanted to know?
No, there was another one which was also included in the title, the potential use of
yes,
green bonds in the TRANS-SAHARA project, which is very relevant for our project.
Yes.
Thank you.
So this is something that, again, it's something that I would like to pose to everybody, because I'm no specialist on that. But it seems to me that there could be two avenues for this sort of thing. First of all, we need to have very clear indicators of what we're trying to achieve and measurable, right? But I could imagine countries or a consortium of countries issuing debt saying, look, under the Trans-Sahara market, please lend us money so we can achieve those goals that we're trying to achieve via the labs, for example, and we will deliver your money back at a certain interest rate, plus those goals that we are targeting, right? If we don't achieve those goals, for whatever reason, well, you get compensated by receiving more money back. And if we achieve these goals or do better than these goals, the project then gets a discount on the payment to lenders. That's something that I would, from what I saw of the structure, that's something possible. It could be done via consortium, or it could be done via specific countries. Now, the problem that you have to think about is basically issuing bonds. You're talking about usually not only you need to be credit worthy or to have some sort of credit analysis done, just like any borrowing from banks, but also they are not cheap. So it makes sense to issue bonds when you're talking about large amount of money. If you're talking about like $2 million or low $1 million or $1,000, no, it doesn't make sense to issue a bond. Probably you can do a better job negotiating with banks to get this money. So that's something else that needs to be considered in this equation.
Yeah, thank you very much. Definitely, I think this is something that we have to continue discussing because it's very relevant to what we do in the Trans-Sahara project. And I can see that we have 4 hands raised, Daphne.
Yes.
And yeah.
Thank you very much. So I think one thing that we've seen in these expert talks is that 1 hour is never enough time for having an in-depth discussion. So I want to ask especially Professor Biller if he has time to go on maybe 15 minutes more than what we initially planned,
Sure.
so that we can plan out the questions. Thank you. And I also, want to remind us that this, as it said in the first slide, is like an initial discussion. So it's more like collecting all of the open questions. And very few of us have any background in economics. So it's really a first insight into what green bonds are and how they could be useful for Trans-Sahara. So with that in mind, I would like to encourage the next 3 questions to try and keep it concise so that we can try and cover all of the questions. And as I said, we're taking notes and we're going to come back to all of this in more depth in future discussions. So I think that Abram is first in line, then Mengistu, and then Professor Daly.
Thank you very much, Daphne. Thank you, Professor, for the presentation and the way you give us insight on green bonds. And I think it is promising for Trans-Sahara and for Africa in general. But my question is, these bonds are a mix of political, macroeconomy, and ecology. And some of the things, especially the macroeconomy issues, are decided somewhere, and especially in some countries, what we can see is not is gloomy. And in that case, is there a risk that green bonds may create divide between beneficiaries and non-beneficiaries in African countries, or is there a way to escape these political barriers? Thank you.
So can I respond each question?
Sure.
Yes, I think that would be the best process.
Okay, so it's correct that any bond is related to macroeconomy because it's basically related to interest rates, right? So you're competing with different, let's say, financial assets, and even within the bond market, different bond issues, right? So, but this is how it is to most financial instruments. So I don't see this as something, let's say, different, right? Now, dividing between beneficiaries and non-beneficiaries, I don't know if I fully understand the question. So it depends really who issues the bond, right? So if the country issues the bond or the debt, whether the country issues the bond to pay for salaries in the global administration on the administration, or issues the bond to make an environmental investment, essentially society, or this country's society, is responsible, quote unquote, for this bond, right? Now, I much rather have a bond with a goal that benefits society than a bond which can be used for any sort of thing that I don't have control of, right? So, but to do that, I have two venues. I could either earmark that bond, or I could say, no, instead of earmarking the bond, give me, as a society, what we need. We need a better service, a better environmental quality, right? Whether you spend your money on other things, that doesn't matter, as long as you give me what I'm looking for, which is paying back the debt plus an environmental or a better service or environmental quality. So for me, it's better. Now, of course, for the receiving country, a grant may be better, right? But the point that we're discussing here is that there is not enough grants out there to support this agenda. So that's what we're talking about. And what we're trying to design is an instrument that actually goes directly to potential investors. So I much rather have my money going from my decision to an environmental outcome than going through a government or going through an NGO to that environmental outcome, if I can verify that I'm achieving that goal that I'm looking for. I'm not sure that I answered the second question, but I hope that I clarified the idea.
Yes,
Thank you very
Professor.
much. Abram, is it fine?
Yes, Daphne. Yeah, we'll learn more in the process.
Good, thank you. Okay, Mengistu.
Thank you, Daphne, and thank you for the presentation. It's so important for our project. I have three questions. The first one is about additionality of green bond. Given that green bond mainly earmark the use of proceeds rather than changing the financial structure, do we have evidence that they actually generate additional green investment rather than simply relabeling projects that would have been financed in any way? That's one. Second one is about credibility and greenwashing. Since certification and reporting are mostly based on third-party verification, how effective are these mechanisms at preventing this greenwashing? My third question is about measurement and verification. How would the environmental outcomes be measured and verified in practice? Yeah, as you know, for example, with something like deforestation, how do you ensure the indicators are reliable, not affected by measurement noise or satellite data limitations? That are the three questions. Thank you.
So these are very good questions. Let me go by parts then, following the the order. So have green bonds generated additional green investment? So the answer to this is, I would say, yes. It depends how you define, right? So if you're issuing a bond to increase investments on renewable energy, let's say solar and wind mills, this is very easily verifiable. Have you purchased a solar farm? Are you creating solar farms? Yes or no? And that's where certification comes in. So I don't have a whole bunch. I don't have much of a doubt that this has been right. It's an outcome. Oh, sorry, it's an output. So this will happen. Why do I say that? Because if it doesn't, that's a breach of contract, right? So and this would be widely announced. That is not, I would say, the main problem, quote unquote, of the current green bonds that we have. The main issue is that, frankly, I don't think that even though there is an increase in issuing, right, there's growth on the issuing, there's not much difference between a green bond versus a non-green bond. So if the World Bank issues a green bond saying we're going to invest in renewable energy, and the World Bank also issues non-green bonds, I have the same interest rate being paid in both. So yes, sure, I'm going to choose the green bond because I'm interested in environment, right? So my compensation is the same. So there, I think it's where the green bond story sort of wobbles. And this links to your greenwashing idea, which is, I tend to agree with you that most of the green bonds issued, since they earmark the ring fence expenditures, companies and even countries are doing this just for marketing purpose. Look, we are environmentally conscious, right? Because there's no real advantage. I would say to the issuer, there is a disadvantage because I could issue a bond and do with this money what I want, or I could issue a bond with the same interest, very with ring fence fixed use of the proceeds, right? So for the issuer, I would prefer the first one. Mm-hmm. So the only reason why I prefer the second one, most likely, it's marketing value. Let's put it this way. Measurements. Now, I think that this is the biggest challenge of that story, because measurements or indicators need to be simple, clear, and transparent. If there's too much noise, then it's the wrong indicator. That's why very often what you happen, and personally, I think that you have more success on things like deforestation, where, if I stop believing in FSC, for example, as a certifier, I can see on the picture whether forest cover increased or not, number one. The other one, which is water quality, is generally well measured and very clear. But if you tell me I want to issue a green bond on biodiversity, it becomes complicated because, well, what is biodiversity? For you, it may be saving the elephants. For me, it may be ecosystem quality. So that becomes a lot more complicated to address. Thank you for the excellent questions, by the way.
Thank you very much. That's all.
Thank you. Fantastic. So I think initially Eleanor was next and then Professor Daly, but now the order is switched. Let's go ladies first. Eleanor?
Thanks, Stephanie, and thank you for the great presentation, Professor Billa. I wanted to ask a little bit more about the environmental impact bonds you mentioned. and whether they are more appropriate for sort of project-based entities. And specifically, there's challenges in Trans-Sahara in terms of scale. So are they appropriate for landscape scale interventions and timeframes? So if you have agroforestry, it can take a long time for the trees to grow and those ecosystems or environmental outcomes to be achieved. And is that an issue for environmental impact bonds, or any instrument that can work directly with investors? And then I guess, does this political risk insurance you mentioned, is that appropriate for environmental impact bonds?
Okay, so excellent questions also. So let me, you're right. The environmental impact bonds are generally project related. So for example, a municipality, this has been done in the US, like as I mentioned, Durham, Atlanta, I think that Washington, DC as well. Basically, they issued a debt bond and they promised, let's say, improved water quality or restoration of wetlands, given certain indicators, right? Generally, they are water quality related. So yes, the answer to your question is yes, they're project, they are like project bond, but instead of, let's say, delivering a percentage of the toll road as payments for investors, they are delivering improved quality of some sort besides the coupon payment. Yeah. Now, in terms of the agroforestry outcomes and the time to maturity, let's put it this way, I think that bonds are good at that. Why do I say that? Because in agroforestry, you have intermediate goals, right? So as bonds can, I mean, just to give you an idea, you have some sovereigns and companies issuing what's called perpetual bonds. Those are 100-year bonds. Now, none of us, when we were born, can buy a 100-year bond and expect to live through the life of that bond, right? I mean, it's clearly the idea here, it's not to outlive the bond. The idea here is to be able to hold the bond for a period, depending on how much it's paying as a yield, and sell that bond later on to get the rewards of that bond. Now, of course, this is a function of investors. Now, on the side of the issuer can issue, if it can issue a 100-year bond, and most bonds go up to 30 years, we're talking about long term, right? That's why this type of instruments works well, say, on infrastructure, because a power plant, a bridge, and so on usually have a life of 30 years. Now, as far as I know, agroforestry projects also have this sort of life, right? What I mean by that, it can go longer than that, but in cost-benefit analysis, you do an investment thinking about 30 years. You don't do an investment thinking of 100 years. Now, if you can issue a financial instrument, which you can, that has a maturity of up to 100 years, it's a benefit, or it's a gift for things like climate change, because climate change is further down in the future. And the market price this type of investment, right? So that means people are willing to buy 100-year bonds, not thinking whether, for example, Mexico issue 100-year bonds, not thinking whether Mexico will disappear in 70 years, right? So people are willing to buy, they are valuing this asset for whatever reason. So I would say that you could build mechanisms in projects, long-term projects, in which investors will get both the environmental return expected for that time, right? Because you're paying, for example, coupons every year, and or it will signal to investors that the direction of the project is towards delivering the environmental outcome. So, for example, in the example that I gave of net deforestation in Brazil, essentially by 2030, well, Brazil issues a bond that actually pays, it's a zero coupon bond, it will pay you the principal plus interest in 2030. Now, I can include in this a component for, did you deliver also zero net deforestation? Yes or no. If you did better, in other words, the forest actually expanded, there you go, you pay less principal. If you did worse, well, you owe me more money. So that's not very complicated. It works, by the way, the same as inflation. Now, PRI, why PRI? The advantage of PRI is essentially because the issuer of those guarantees, right, of the political risk insurance, they may be better, and they are usually much better rated than the issuer of the bond. That's why the market buys that instrument, right? So in a market where it's new, for example, or you may not trust the issuer so much, PRI can come as an incentive, right? Give you an example. MIGA, the World Bank, is rated AAA, right? The lowest default possibility. Now, if Ghana, which is rated B-, issues a sovereign bond, okay? Well, and the investor buys a guarantee from MIGA, usually it's the investor that buys the guarantee from MIGA, well, the investor is no longer taking Ghana risk, it's taking World Bank risk, which is much lower risk. For that, it has to pay a premium, just like any insurance. The same story occurs here. Suppose that Brazil, again, using the example of deforestation in Brazil, Brazil is rated, I think, almost investment level, which is BB+, okay? So if Brazil basically issues a non-honoring of environmental outcomes guarantee in that idea of the green bond, and, sorry, not Brazil issues, but the World Bank covers that part, right, through a premium, essentially, you're no longer taking the risk of Brazil, you're now taking the risk of the World Bank, and there's a huge difference between the two. Therefore, you will pay a premium. You as an investor will pay a premium, but you know that your risk in your balance sheet is mitigated, which is usually what investors are trying to do. They're trying to mitigate the different risks of their investments. So I hope I answered your question there, Eleanor.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Great, thanks. So let's jump to Professor Daly. And if you can please be concise. We have 4 more minutes and then we promise to wrap up.
He's muted. You're muted.
Sorry. Thank you, Daphne. Thank you, Professor Biller, for your conference. My question is about the adaptation of agroforestry projects to green bonds. It's quite related to the last question. So for the agroforestry projects, usually we have lack of information and we have also lack of measurement and reporting, especially for benefits. And let's the same similarly to the Eleanor, the main features of agroforestry projects that we have huge investment and at the beginning, but the benefits came later after 20 years or more. So do you think that these green bonds are quite adequate to agroforestry projects, or maybe we should think to other economic instruments also?
So, okay, I don't think that the second problem that you described is a major issue, right? Because this is the nature of a lot of infrastructure projects and even companies, right? Companies build plants to produce things, but they have a hiatus between their revenues coming in, right? So usually it's not 20 years, maybe it's 7 years, but you could like invest for 5 years, you're spending money, and yet you only get money later on. So I do not think that this is an unsurmountable obstacle. In fact, this is pretty much the nature of the business, right? Now, if you're talking about that you only get returns 50 years from now, yes, that's going to be a problem. But within 30 years, I think it's a question of the type of returns you get. I think that agroforestries, I know a few agroforest projects well, and what they often suffer is that if the price of their quote unquote commodity is very low. Take, for example, cocoa. And this is a problem we had in Brazil. So cocoa can be shade cocoa, growing and protecting forest, but it could also be plantation, right? So if the price of cocoa is very high, it pays to cut the natural forest and do plantation. If the price of cocoa is very low, it pays to cut the natural forest and put cattle in the area. So that's very fickle. You need to have the price of cocoa be just right so the forest is protected while cocoa is produced, right? Usually by small farmers and so on. So very often, the idea that most economies have, I heard a lot, is, well, why don't you subsidize the price of cocoa to be in that limitation? Well, I could answer, why don't you just hire the small farmers, give them a gun and say, your job now is to protect the forest, because this is what I want. I want forest protection. I don't want more cocoa or less cocoa necessarily, right? So those are alternatives to this objective. Now, in my view, if anything, a green bond type of instrument will actually mitigate or diminish the uncertainty related to this, not augment, right? Because essentially you're bringing transparency and a core set of acceptable indicators to deliver a particular goal that you're trying to achieve. So that's my view. Now, do agroforestries have more uncertainty? I would say that depends on the objective of the agroforestry project. But the more items you add to the objectives, of course, the more uncertainty and risks you're going to get. And ultimately, it's the example that I gave of biodiversity. Biodiversity is a lot of things. So I wouldn't start using instruments like green bonds as the right instrument, let's say, to deliver more biodiversity, because I need to have a common agreed indicator on biodiversity to be able to deliver that outcome, right? You have several examples. For example, you have another example from Brazil that I know very well, which is a subsidy for conservation, and they call it biodiversity royalty. Well, it's not a biodiversity royalty, it's a forestry royalty. It conserves tropical forests, right? You're paid against forested area, but you don't know inside of the forest what's happening. You don't know if hunting increased. You don't know if hearts of palms are being illegally exploited and so on, because all you see is a picture and you base your payment on that satellite picture. Now, doesn't the market is able to negotiate and address this sort of uncertainties? Well, my favorite example, I'm also a natural resource economist and geophysicist, is your story of petroleum. I mean, oil basically is a very uncertain natural resource activity. You don't know whether you're going to find it, when you're not going to find it. And ultimately, when you do production sharing agreement, you're somehow sharing risks related to the activity, meaning, will we find oil or not? If we find oil, how much does the country takes in that scheme over time, right? So I do believe that those are obstacles that can be surpassed based on the financial engineering part. Again, very clear. Oil production, oil extraction, very clear outcome, very clear indicator. If you add a lot of indicators, then you're going to add complications to this system.
Thank you, Professor.
Great, fantastic. And now the question is if we can take even a couple more minutes, because now Stanislav Smilev is here. He's also an economist, and he has one final question before we wrap up. Would that be fine? I know we're going far over time, but yeah, there are so many questions. Would that be okay?
Sure.
Dan?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Stanislav, would you like to ask your questions? Your question?
Hello. Thank you so much. Really inspiring talk. I'm wondering if you could maybe mention some specific African examples of anybody daring to issue green bonds and which types of projects they covered. I mean, we are aware of a huge diversity of green bonds that we use to support infrastructure, for example, for sustainable cities everywhere around the world. And also this very, very new approaches about conservation of forest and reforestation, which are now supported by the governments of Norway and so on. But in the African context, and also, I would like to reiterate, I think this is a really, really critical point. I agree with you that green bonds have an enormous potential because of the long time horizon, because of mitigating risks, and because of the fact that it's an infrastructure, it's a green infrastructure effectively, right? So if you could just answer very briefly on the African examples, and also the general kind of advice about if anybody was to launch a green bond in a new environment, what to look out for. Thank you.
So I know of no country in Africa that have issued a standard green bond, and obviously no country that issue an outcome-based green bond, because that's a new idea. But I would expect that certain countries certain large economies in Africa, like South Africa, for example, which are well rated in the international market, could be part of green investments via green bonds. Yeah. So I wouldn't be surprised if even South Africa have issued green bonds as a sovereign itself, but I don't know if it has. Now, the concern that I would have related to this, it starts with the countries, right? Because very often we're talking about, in Africa, we're talking about HIPIC countries, meaning low income countries, which very often do not have access to international markets. So I was actually pleasantly surprised to see that Senegal, Ghana, Tunisia expected, but Senegal, Ghana, Ethiopia do have access to international markets, bond markets. And I was not surprised that Djibouti doesn't, right? I mean, this I expected. So I think, like we see with the normal green bonds, I would expect that any idea related to green bonds would be easier to implement in larger economies in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa. Ghana is one of them. South Africa is another one. Countries that are well accustomed with international issuing of bonds. So now, I think that, sorry, what's your second question? Could you repeat?
The second question concerned if anybody would be issuing a green bond today, what would be your, main, I don't know, top three pieces of advice? What to look out for, which aspects to consider? It's a very general question, but I hope that will be a nice wrap up.
I'm advising the issuer or the buyer?
The issuer. The issuer.
The issuer. Okay, so first of all, I would like to have a well-defined. Okay, first, if you're issuing a green bond, say to ring fence the investments, my question to the issuer would be, why are you doing this? Because essentially, my impression is that they do it because of the marketing value. So I would like to know what is the marketing value of issuing something that is actually constraining my ability to use the money rather than giving me more flexibility, right? So we can probably assign a value to that, evaluate this marketing benefit, let's say, because my impression is that you don't get any benefit, or not my impression, I know you don't get any benefit from the side of low interest, for example. And you have additional administrative expenditures because you need to get it certified and so on. So, does your marketing returns compensate for this additional expenditures? So that would be my first question to the issuer. Now, if I'm talking about an outcome-based green bond, then I would like to know more details on how I'm going to be measured in this, in the ability of delivering what I'm committing to, right? So I would pay particular attention on these indicators, how they are measured, and try to assess somehow let's say, the value, the benefits of this extra layer of delivering environmental benefits versus getting some financial compensation. So I will try to have try to do some financial engineering and some valuation to try to assess that, right? To see if it's for the issuer really makes sense. Now, that would be my main focus. So that, as I said, the more indicators are put in the picture, the more complication I am getting. So even as an issuer or as a buyer, I would want to have something simpler in the beginning, pretty much like inflation indexation, right? So inflation, you know the numbers of the inflation next month, next quarter, whatever, they are all, you have an acceptable, reputable source that you accept as your index to measure inflation. You are being compensated by this index, right? Now, measuring inflation or measuring the index may be very complicated, but I don't need to know how this is done to be willing to buy that instrument. If I believe that inflation will go up, I want protection against inflation. So then I buy inflation protected security. So the same idea would work in a green bond that is outcome based. If I, as a buyer, want to buy something that delivers some environmental or promises to deliver some environmental outcome, I want to know how this is measured and what sort of outcome we're talking about. And if this is not delivered, what sort of compensation do I get? For the issuer, this is something that they have to be concerned with.
Sorry,
Okay.
definitely, as your moderator, I think you raised your hand and then you have deprived yourself of asking the question.
So
Can you be the
I
last
wanted
one?
to thank you very much, Professor Fanta. I have so many questions. I have like 5 or 6 questions lined up, but I think we should wrap up because now we're going half an hour over time. So I just want to inspire us. I think it would this topic deserves a lot more attention, and I would like to invite Professor Biller as an advisory board member to join us for a workshop. I suggest that we have a 2-day workshop if he's available, if you're available, with this group. It can be maybe in Oxford, where Stanislav is based, or in Addis Abeba, or let's find a place that's feasible for everyone. It's such a suggestion so that we can spend more time on this. We need a serious amount of discussion. I can see some opportunities maybe for a joint exploration, joint research, even a joint publications on various topics that were raised today. And I would like to leave that one with Leah for the time being. And I also want to suggest if we can start something like an email stream also for the persons in this group with Professor Biller for the questions that have already come up today in order to continue the conversation, so to speak, offline. So those are 2 suggestions in closing. And it leaves me just to thank Professor Biller very much for this incredibly information-packed talk and all the answers to our questions. It's a complex topic, so there are a lot of questions. We're just beginning to get some understanding of how this relates to Trans-Sahara. We're really excited to think about how to develop some kind of a financial mechanism together with you. So a big thank you from Trans-Sahara for your support and commitment.
So first of all, let me say, I didn't do this with the emojis because I couldn't find the emoji in
for you
in this platform. But there you go, 2 of them for the ideas. So I'm more than happy to participate as well. Also, I'd like to thank everybody for the excellent questions. I thought that the questions were great, and it's always good to be able to exchange ideas with people that are also not economists, because the type of questions also are different, right? for obvious reasons. And I think that the beauty of the subject that we study is exactly this interdisciplinarity that it has. So I have to confess that, for example, when I first presented the idea in Duke University, and it was in the School of Environment, that there were specialists from forestry and so on, and including forest specialists on satellite imagery. So I asked, related to is that feasible? And they said yes. So don't worry about the finance, but is that feasible in terms of measuring forest size and things like this? So the answer is yes, and that's a good possibility. Carbon is another good possibility because those things are in principle well measured. As I mentioned, biodiversity, it's a lot more of a headache, but it's a challenge. And it's always great to have a challenge to look for solving. So thank you very much, and thank you for your patience, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the great questions. Looking forward for the workshop.
Thank you so much,
Thank you
Professor
very
Biller.
much. Thank you.
Well,
much indeed.
just to wrap up then finally, just to say that our next Expert Talks is on Friday, actually. So got two in quick succession with Professor Michael Jacobson from Penn State University. So just to invite you all, and after this I'll share the link so you can all take part. So, but thanks you very much, Professor Miller, and to all of you with your excellent questions. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Sure.